we want to thank you for coming up today, and we enjoy having you here. My name is AJ Smith, and we'll have Sebastian Hill, Dr. Sally Bloomstrom, and today we're interviewing Hal Cope and Barbara Cope, his lovely wife.
I didn't know that happened.
So,
We might have made him.
Okay, go ahead.
okay, so we can get started today by, I believe Dr. Bloomstrom might want to start off the interview. So I'll hand over the mic to Dr. Bloomstrom.
Thank you, AJ. And thank you so much for being here today, Hal. We really appreciate this. One of the areas that came to my attention when you were here last time was your real passion for wanting to help our students. And one of the aspects that I thought we might get at that through is to look at entrepreneurship with the non-SCEDs and to ask you some questions. And what I really want to get at are those lifelong lessons that applied for the non-SCEDs and would equally apply today for our students. So we were hoping you could tell us a little bit about the background of the non-SCEDs, how those ventures were created, how they did marketing, how they got their financing, and then probably more importantly, what can the students today get from that?
Well, let me start out by saying that my passion, as everybody at ERAU knows, is that I think the students need to be exposed to history of aviation, because history is the future. And if I'm going to phrase it in my own personal life here for a minute, I came out of World War II and decided that I wanted to learn to fly an airplane. Now, this is at a time when, there's thousands of pilots being discharged from the Army or the Air Force. And my family all thought I was crazy. But I stuck with that dream, and I learned to fly. And 2 weeks after I got my last certification on airplanes, it qualified me to fly commercially. I got a job flying DC-3s with a little-known airline out of Burbank, California, flying strawberries out of the Imperial Valley. And that was the beginning of my 60-year airline management career. Now, this kid from Cottonwood, Arizona, decided to learn to fly in spite of the fact thousands of pilots are being discharged. But so many people have helped me along the way that I feel I have an obligation and a responsibility and a joy to share with people who were I was like you guys. Mm-hmm. You're learning. What are you going to do with it? Where are you going to go? How is it going to happen? And I think I have a responsibility of having been there and done that, to pass whatever knowledge and experience and help I can. And that's why every time I come home to here, I feel like I'm coming home, because there are all these young people here learning to fly or to other forms of management. Mm-hmm. And it's just something. But all through my career, I have been helped. First, my 4 bosses, Jack Lewin, Red Hart, Stan Weiss, and Jim Fishburne. They taught me the airline business, which carried me on. And I have met so many people along the path that has helped me. And it's just incredible to me that I can go and sit in the bush with General Doolittle, the icon of all aviation people and pilots. and tell Jimmy how to fly an airplane. Now, nobody tells Jimmy Doolittle how to fly an airplane, but I did. But it's that sort of help along the way that I feel very fortunate and very lucky. In the non-skid industry, Sally, it wasn't like that. I mean, we started out in the non-skid industry with hope and a dream and ran into all sorts of hurdles. I mean, initially we didn't because we were small and, you know, people were coming out of the World War II era and there was a lot of hope for the future, and the grandfathered airlines were secure in their position with the government and their assigned routes. So we came along, and they didn't begin to realize what a threat we were to them until our company, for example, got 10 DC-4s, and then we bought brand new DC-6Bs, and it began to open their eyes to what was happening with this little industry down here. And it was a battle. We knew it going in, but we had this dream and we had this hope, and we had the tenacity to hang in with that dream. And we did hang in with that dream. We had a lot of problems. North American Aviation took us to court and tried to get the court to deny us of using the name North American. And my boss got on the stand and he said, tell North American that we won't manufacture airplanes if they won't fly passengers. But it was that sort of harassment time and time and time and time again. Every time we turned around, there was a harassment from the scheduled airlines through the Civil Aeronautics Board and through Congress. But we held on, and we held on, fighting with trying to keep our head above water, not financially, but economically, legally, to have a place in the industry. Because we felt very strongly that there was a market out there that had never been touched by the scheduled airlines. Only 20% of the American population had ever flown an airplane in 1947, 48. The people were traveling on the train and the bus. And we felt we could reach those people with a lower airfare and good service. And that's what we did. We did. We marketed in different ways that nobody heard of. We couldn't afford radio and TV ads. As I said before, we made little signs and coupons, and we took them. I personally, as the Vice President of Operations, delivered them on my off time to drugstores around the Los Angeles area. If somebody saw a coupon in a drugstore and bought a ticket, the drugstore got a small commission from that. And we did those things. We had Frank Sinatra do a song for us called One Little Engine, Two Little Engine, Three Little Engine, Four Little Engines, because we had gone from DC-3s to DC-4s. And Frank was a friend of some of us, and he did this song for us. So that's another way that we approached of getting our name out in front. And we had very, very good service. There was no question about it. Our schedule reliability was good. In those days, box lunches were standard for most airlines. And I can tell you, though, that a DC-3 flight from Burbank, California to LaGuardia Airport in 1949 and 50 was not a flight, it was a happening. You left Burbank at 9:30 at night and you didn't get to New York until 4 o'clock the next afternoon, after about 7 stops along the way. But people, for $99, they could get on an airplane and go from Los Angeles to New York. And that was unheard of. The scheduled airlines' lowest prices in that era was $136. And eventually they came down to us, and we had to compete with them on the $99 coaching. But we were mired for 10 years in legal, political entrapment every step of the way. There's no question about it. And we fought hard, because we felt that we had a right, just because they grandfathered 8 or 10 carriers under the Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938. We didn't think that that closed the market to everybody forevermore. And when the World War II was over, we had surplus airplanes, we had surplus pilots. These guys wanted to fly. Kirk Kerkorian, Stan Weiss, Ralph Cox, all of the major players in the non-skid were most of them were ex-pilots who wanted to continue to fly. And so they found some financing. Financing wasn't easy for us. Just to give you an example, Kirk Kerkorian and I decided that we wanted to go from the Constellations to jet equipment. We wanted to be the first non-skid to put jet equipment into service. And I was telling Bill and Steve earlier, we went down to, we had heard that Convair had one 990 left over from their manufacturing, and they had pieces for 4 more. So we went to San Diego, and we looked at the 990, and we looked at all these pieces hanging on the shelves in this down to San Diego, Consolidated. And the more that I thought about it, I said, Kirk, we ought to stick with something that's moving, like Douglas or McDonnell or Boeing. And the 990 was designed by, what's his name, owned TWA, and it wasn't a very good design to begin with. So we went to the Bank of America in Los Angeles. Kirk knew Walter Sharp. We walked into Walter's office and we said, we want to borrow $5 million. Well, what do you want it for? Well, we want to buy this DC-8 from Delta Airlines, 08 Delta. So Walter said, well, what have you got for security? Well, the Constellations were leased. We didn't have any. We had a good profit margin on the airline operation. And Kirk said, well, we don't have anything. Walter said, I knew it was coming. He loaned us the $500, $5 million for that airplane. And that's the way we got into the jet business. The first non-skid to put a jet into operation. But Walter Sharp had the faith in us to do. We had a good record. I had a good name. Kirk had a good name. He didn't own Las Vegas then. That was long before he owned Las Vegas. And MGM and a few other things. But there was a lot of faith involved in the non-skid. You had to have faith in that we had a future. And the employees were always gung-ho to work. We never had a union in any of our airlines. They were just, everybody was treated fairly and everybody paid a good wage, and we worked hard for it. My days were 17 hours a day. That's what my days were. Like most people in the non-skid, I loaded baggage, changed engines, flew airplanes, whatever it took to make it work. And it was a spirit, and we were competitors with Great Lakes and USOA and these other people, but we were all friends and we were all comrades. In the sense, we never fought with each other, although I told Bill that Ralph Cox could get most irrational at times. But we still, if they needed a part and we had it, we gave it to them. Or if we needed an engine, somebody would give us an engine so we got ours back and going. It was that sort of camaraderie that really was the foundation of the non-skid airline and kept it alive for as long as it was.
Thank you. What I'm hearing you say is hard work, positive attitude, getting along with your colleagues and with your competitors is really what helped the non-skids and made them a very important part of aviation history. What would you add to that for these young men?
I couldn't add much to it. I don't think it was unique to the non-skids. I think there are probably companies today, although few and far between. I think the spirit was the one thing that was left out of there. It was the spirit of everybody. This was something we were building. This is something that was needed. We wanted to offer economic transportation to the American people. And we had this spirit, this thought, this dream that we held on to. And everybody held on to it, down to the last drop. And the Supreme Court put North American Airlines out of business by decree in 1957, I think it was. Canceled our operating certificate, and even went so far as to have an order against the four owners, my bosses. They could never indulge in any type of airline operation the rest of their life.
Well, it seems like you care a lot about aviation, and back then, the company that you worked for, what did you feel like after basically the U.S. government shut down what you had worked so hard for and loved?
Well, you know, that's another thing. They did shut us down, and I would have been out of a job, but again, good Lord, or somebody was looking out after me. I went back and worked with our association on the Hill for 2 years on legislation. And then Benny Goodman, who owns Saturn Airways down in Miami, wanted me to go to work for him. And while I was there, I was offered another presidency. And then Kirk called and said, well, come back to California, I need you. And so I came back to California, and he finally sold the airline to Studebaker, and I had enough Studebaker certificates to wallpaper my bathroom with. It was worthless, but anyway, we sold it. And then I had an opportunity to go to Africa, and I went to Africa. So my path on my dream was never seemed to be interrupted. It was a constant. And again, a lot of people held out their hand to me. You know, Benny, I had a good name in the industry. There's no question about that. And I'm proud of it. And if I was unemployed, you know, I had people at my door. I was in Africa and was coming home in when was I in Africa? 62 or 67. Coming home, and I sent a cable out to a couple of people, and I got one back from Ed Daly of World Airways the next day. He said, you're coming to work here as soon as you hit the United States of America. And I worked for Ed Daly, but he was such an irascible old guy. I couldn't stand him more than 6 months. And I was then offered the job of the president of Transair Airlines in Canada. So there was always somebody and an opportunity, and you can't be afraid of moving from where you are to something else. It takes courage sometimes to do this, because, you know, I didn't know I had a wife and 3 children, but I never think I lost a day's work anywhere along the path 60 years. Because I had faith in myself, I had faith in my dream, and I worked hard. There's no question, and built a name and a reputation for myself. So my dream was never really interrupted, but I had a lot of people along the way helping me. A lot of people.
I'd kind of like to move the interview more into a story about how you were talking about Kirk Kerkorian and how you and him were starting the airline. I was wondering, what is your favorite story about a non-skid starting up, finding money, and just getting off the ground?
Well, I wasn't with Kirk when he started his first airline. That came later. But the story I heard about Kirk, and he won't deny it, I don't think, is that his first office on the airport, Los Angeles Airport, was an engine crate. Had office above it, and that was his office. He lived out of an engine crate. The people that I worked for and started with, Red and Jack were operating one DC-3, and they were carrying, as I said, strawberries out of the Imperial Valley. Stan Weiss and Jimmy Ferguson were Long Beach operating one DC-3, and they were doing some charters. And finally, somebody said, why don't we put these two airlines together? So we took the two airlines. I can remember the meeting very well at the Burbank Airport where Stan and the Four Horsemen, as they became known as, sat in this little room, and they decided to create North American Airlines. And what we did was merge Standard Airways, which was Stan's, and Viking into North American Airlines. And it worked. And we didn't have a lot of money. I mean, Jack and Stan didn't have a lot of money. Jack and Red and Stan and Jimmy had more money than we did. But it was a matter of astute businessship. Jim Fishgun was our finance guy, and you talk about being able to find money and use it properly. Jimmy was very good at it. Jack was good at marketing. Stan was good at public relations, and Red was good at people. And it worked very well. And that was the foundation of the company. We hired good people. And money was never seemed to be a problem because we had a good name, we had good reputation, and we had a good bottom line. And we could borrow the money. When we bought our first DC-6Bs from Douglas, we didn't have any trouble financing them with Bank of America because we were operating a good airline, we were making money, and we had good management. I mean, the Four Horsemen and the people that in the higher echelon were good managers, and they all came up bootstrapped together and did their jobs. A lot of people got into the airline business in the non-skids because they had money or because they could bootstrap on somebody else. But most of the non-skids were operating sort of hand to mouth.
I'll ask another question. Nowadays, information moves so quickly. You can collect data in seconds, analyze it, and make a decision within hours of something happening. Back when you were working in aviation, what tools did you use to make decisions on whether it be fuel or pilots and how to get everything there? How did it operate from day to day?
That's an interesting question because at North American, I wasn't inside others' airlines at the time, but at North American, the one thing that those four bosses did, when they hired somebody and gave them a responsibility, they turned them loose. Never, obviously there were discussions about decisions, but there was never any threats or animosities or anything like that. I hired Bill Butler as the chief pilot, Stan hired me as VP Ops, and we had Bryce Colclaser as maintenance. But we all had our jobs and we all did it. We had broad directions. And as far as communications, we were there 16, 17 hours a day together at headquarters, so we could communicate pretty frequently and constantly. As far as intercontinentally, all we had was a Twix. You know what a Twix was? A Twix was a machine you sat down with and you typed it out and it went by Western Union or something to wherever you directed it. And I can remember that the last thing I did at night after I'd come to work in the morning and the eastbound airplane would be landing at Burbank, I would have already scheduled the crew in the airplane to go to San Francisco to take the passengers on up. I would help unload the baggage off the 3. I'd dispatch the airplane to San Francisco, work in the office all day, maybe fly a shuttle myself someplace, come and help check in the passengers at night, and even sometimes dispatch the airplane. And the last thing I did at the end of my 17 hours was set up that Twix machine and send messages to Kansas City and Chicago and New York that the airplane is off, X number of passengers to Kansas City, X number of passengers to, and that was the way we communicated. That's the only thing we had. And a telephone, obviously. And that was it. But we had offices and people in Kansas City and in Chicago and in New York and Miami and Dallas and other places. So we had good people. And I cannot overemphasize good when I say good. Good people who were dedicated and who were honest and who worked hard. And I think part of that was because the leaders, not just myself, but Stan and Jimmy and the rest of them, worked as hard as we did. So that was there. But we didn't have all the modern conveniences of instant communication, I can tell you. And they didn't have it. But you make do with what you have.
Yeah.
You've talked about customer service and financing. What about maintenance?
Maintenance was one of the easiest things for us to handle. I mean, because when we first started out, we didn't have the funds for a maintenance shop, so we contracted our maintenance out with Flying Tiger Line, Bob Prescott, huh? And a lot of the non-skids did that. And when we went to Kansas City, if we would contract out our ground handling because we didn't have vast staffs of people. We didn't have Taj Mahal terminals. We had operated out of a little counter someplace with a sign that said North American Airlines. But we worked at doing the maintenance in such a manner, even though we had it contracted out with Flying Tiger Line. We had Bryce Calclaser was in charge of maintenance. We had representatives that watched over everything that the Tigers did on our airplane. And then we eventually had built our own maintenance hangar and had our own maintenance people and our everything still. And we were very close to suppliers in Burbank, from Douglas and other places, that we didn't have to have huge supply of spare parts because it was available to us, like putting nobody in a car and going down Douglas and get a starter or a generator or something. But we did a lot of maintenance for other people after we built our own hangar. So maintenance never seemed to be a problem for us. And nobody can ever fault the majority of the non-skids for safety violations. There was very few. There obviously are some that flaunted the regulations, safety regulations. We never did. And most of the non-skids did not. We were very conscious of that because we were fighting the economic battle. We didn't want to give them another arrow in their quiver on the safety side. And we never had an accident. Well, one. We had a DC-3. Captain Chesley was flying it. And he'd been up 3 days berthing with his wife before he took this flight. And he was sleepy. And he got over Zuni, New Mexico, and lost the right engine on the DC-3. And Ray came wide awake, believe me. And he crashed this DC-3, controlled crashed this DC-3 in this farmer's yard Zuni, New Mexico in the middle of the night with these landing lights on. And a boulder went right down through the center of the airplane and sort of turned up the seats. Not a passenger was hurt. And we came in and Radford sent the maintenance guys in, and we scavenged all the parts that were usable, and we left the carcass laying with this guy's farm. And he used it for a chicken coop for 3 years. And then the price of DC-3s went up, and Stan said, let's go get that carcass. And we went, hauled the airplane back to Long Beach and rebuilt it. And the day came to test fly the airplane, and Radford called me and he said, come on down, fly this airplane, test fly this. I said, no problem. So I went down and I looked it over, and the out looked all right. And I said, let's go. He said, what do you mean, let's go? And I said, I'm not flying this airplane unless you and your inspector get on this airplane with me. And then I'll fly the airplane for your test flight. And we got, and 626 was one hell of a good airplane. It really was. After 3 years as a chicken coop, it went back into the air. But that's the only accident that we had at North American. Now, I was with Capital Airways, Jesse Stallings in Tennessee for a while. We were operating Stretch 8 63 models, and we were doing a military route through the North Pack, which is up through Alaska. And on the DC-8, the brakes are very critical because they get hot when you land, and there has to be a cooling off period on the ground before you use them again. Well, it was very cold in Anchorage when this airplane landed, and evidently they got out on the runway for takeoff, and the brakes were still hot. And as they turned onto the runway, the co-pilot was making a takeoff from the right-hand seat. And captain told the co-pilot, one of the guys, and we don't know which one of the guys inadvertently tapped the brake, and it froze all the brakes. And do you know that they pulled full power of that DC-8 and went the full length of the runway, grinding off all the tires and the hubs on those trucks under that DC-8, and hit a 20-foot ditch down at the end of the runway and tore the engine off. It caught fire. We lost 162 passengers out of I think we carried 253 at the time. But the hub, the steel hub, was ground down. It slid down the entire length of that runway. And the captain, who survived, had V1 and V2 on the gauge, his takeoff plan indication. And out of that accident came two very good lessons. Number one, the military always had the remaining runway markers. That was their standard. On military fields, they had 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. So the pilot, commercial airlines did not have that. Commercial fields normally. So if we'd have had that at Anchorage, the captain could have seen that he was still on the ground when he was about to run out of everything. The other thing that happened, and it came out of it, I was there representing the airline with the accident investigation. I requested that we take blood samples from the bed because it didn't make sense to me. And what we found was that the plastic window edges under fire turned into a poisonous gas because some of the bodies were still strapped in the seat. There was no didn't like any physical damage to the body, but they were dead. And what we found was that those plastic moldings around the airplane, when the fire put off a poisonous gas. So we learned two lessons out of that thing, maybe three if we keep our feet off the brakes when you go out on the airport or on the runway. But that's the only really two accidents that I've ever been associated with. And well, one more. I was the president of Transair, and they were in Canada. You get a lot of snow this time of year. and our 737 was making a landing at Brandon, and he saw the snowplow on the runway, but decided to land behind the snowplow. Well, on 737, there's a squat switch, little old thing, 10-cent item. When you touch down, the squat switch goes down, which excites the switch so that you can open the reversers. Well, when it touched down, it sort of touched down one-sided. The squat switch came on, and the reverser came out, and the captain decided to go around. So he hit the power, and on this left side, the buckets were out, and it just cartwheeled the airplane. And the thing we learned from that accident was that there was a safety switch, then put on the squat switch, that both of them had to ignite before one could not ignite. Of course, I've hit a lion or two in Africa, but that.
What other lessons were learned? I mean, you told us, and that's so valuable, about lessons learned from accidents. What other lessons were learned along the way?
Oh, the lessons that we've learned from accidents along the way is just fantastic. I mean, every accident, air accident investigation, it seems like it goes on forever. But there's a reason for that, because the engineers want to rebuild and reconstruct the accident. And out of every airplane accident, there's been some modification. The biggest holdup, and I just read in this morning's Wall Street Journal, is a battle between the Civil Aeronautics Authority and the FAA. The FAA has the control of safety information. The Civil Aeronautics Authority, the board or whatever it is now, wants that information, and they're the ones that determine the outcome of the accident. And there's, like in most government agencies, there's a blockage between the exchange of full information between two government authorities. And I just read it in the Wall Street Journal this morning, where they're still having that battle of the Civil Aeronautics Board, who investigates, and the FAA, who regulates on the exchange of information. But Sally, on every accident investigation is so thorough and so educational. We've learned so much about airplanes. And I'm reading a book called The Ghosts of 401 about the L TriStar that went down in the Everglades in Florida. The pilots had their heads down the cockpit looking at something. They couldn't get the gear down, the one light, and they ended up in the swamp. But it's an interesting story, and the accident investigation is never reluctant to blame pilot error, to lay it on pilot error. And sometimes I think they do it because they have no other explanation for the accident. And if the pilot's dead, he can't stand up for himself. But accident investigation, I think, in the United States is wonderful. It really is. And I wish that they would exchange the information between the two government agencies that are responsible for airline safety.
With the technologies of today, do you believe that non-SCEDs could make a comeback, and that there is an area for people that need something like a non-scheduled airline?
No, because the industry has been deregulated, and you really, in effect, have what we would consider. A lot of people think that Southwest originated the air coach fare. Well, Southwest did not. We did in 1948. So that there's plenty of traffic. I mean, there's plenty of seats available, and I don't believe there would be room for another. The failures we've had since airline deregulation is just unreal. The airline industry has been in a mess forever. I mean, the scheduled airline industry, and it hasn't gotten any better since they put the non-skids out. It got worse when they deregulated the industry. I think that was a mistake. And I used to argue with Alfred Kahn about that. He was doing his dog and pony show across the United States about deregulating the airline industry. And here's an old non-skid guy who would fought the airline is standing up and said, don't do it. You're going to ruin the industry, because so many entrants, new entrants, came into the business. You know, they could they could get airplanes, they could get jets, and they came into the business. So many people, airline went out of business. There's the bankruptcies between deregulation and in 2008 was just horrendous in the airline industry. And so I think deregulation, in my view, was a mistake. I don't think we should have deregulated the industry. And that's a tough statement from an old non-skid who was trying to deregulate the industry, but things have so changed so much. People are now, I bet if you looked at the numbers, 80% of the people in America have flown airplanes, you know, flown commercially. Where back in our day, it was only 20%. And the railroads aren't making any money because people are flying airplanes. So there's a whole change in environment. I don't believe there would be an opportunity for a niche to come along. I can't think of one niche that I would want to get back involved in the airline business, because I don't think there's many niches available that makes any money, that makes any sense. I mean, you've got all the airlines, we got more airlines and seats than we need. Then the airlines are running bankrupt about 75% of the time. Yeah. And, you know, with the price of oil going up, that's going to hurt them more, because that's the lifeblood, is what goes in those engines. If it's going to cost $140 a barrel, you can see some damage to our existing airline operation.
So if someone were to start an airline, how would you suggest that they move through the airline without going into bankruptcy? And how would a person nowadays move through an airline, minimizing their costs and making a profit?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't advise anybody to go in the airline business in the United States or any developed country in the world. I think in some cases in Africa and other developing countries, there is a need, a humanity need, because you can't get people from A to B that need medical attention, for example. But I wouldn't advise anybody to go start an airline in the United States today. Airline business is a disease. There's no known cause, and there's no known cure for it. And people start airlines because, as we did, it's a dream with them, you know. But if you take a hard-nosed look at airline business today, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. I mean, something would have to change. Why would I want to start an airline that I'm going to pay $140 a barrel fuel in that airplane, when we used to get it for 10 cents a gallon? You know, that just doesn't make sense. And the people in the economy the way it is today, people aren't traveling as they used to travel. They don't travel the airline, they can't afford it. You know, they're out of jobs. So I don't see a startup airline making any sense whatsoever in the United States of America, period, at this point in time. There's too many factors stacked against it. I wouldn't, somebody came along and offered me the job of a startup airline, I'd want no part of it. They'd have to have more money than Kirk Kerkorian has got, and they'd lose it. I noticed Kirk is not back in the airline business. Yeah. You know, he thought he had a niche. A few years ago, Kirk started an airline all first class, and he was operating 727s, and it's 10 years ago or so, I guess. And went belly up. And of course, never been back in here. I don't think he's done anything with airplanes since then. So it's tough to find a niche now. Maybe ERA, the university's marketing division, ought to take a look at this airline market situation. Maybe they could find a niche. I don't know, but I don't see one. But I don't see why, with so many people have flown airplanes now. They certainly know about them and can get from A to B very cheaply as compared to other days. The price is going up, and it's going to go up more because of the fuel. But it would be an interesting exercise to look at the market as it is today with all of its pluses and minuses and find a niche. That would be an interesting undertaking.
For these students and other students we have here, given how you see the airline industry today, what courses or what knowledge do you think they need to be armed with?
Management is the key. And that's a tough one, Sally, because most airline managers or people that own an airline think they know everything about it. I mean, you couldn't have told me or somebody else 30 years ago how to run the airline. That they don't know anything about it. But that posture is still here today in a very dangerous time, because I saw the time, even when I was the president of an airline, a very large airline in Canada, every year, listen to this, I've tried to get these guys to do it. Every year, I called an aviation consultant, independent consultant, to come in and look at my airline. Because I, like anybody else, or like you, can get so close to the forest you can't see the trees. Every year I brought a consultant in who looked at my airline and gave me a report and said, this is what I think you should do, this is what I think you shouldn't do. Now, a lot of times, I agreed with some of those things. And I've done the same thing as an aviation consultant. I've consulted in Africa and other places, and for the Industrial Bank of Japan to buy Hawaiian Airlines. And I've done comprehensive analysis of an airline. And it doesn't take me long to figure out what's wrong with an airline. I can walk in 2 weeks, if they give me access to their people and their record, I can tell what's wrong with the airline without any question. And I'll do a report that thick with all the marketing stack backup and the maintenance and the personnel and the whole thing. And 9 times out of 10, they won't take the advice. Now, I had one guy that took my advice, and I talked to him just not long ago, and this was in the early 90s. I went down to Belize on a volunteer project, and John Greff had inherited this from his father, and running between Belize City and San Pedro, a little place. And he was, 1, operating the wrong equipment. 2, he had his sister running the operations for him, which was great. She didn't know from nothing. And I sat down with John, looked at I was there for 3 months on that little island, doing this thing for John. And I talked to him the other day, and I told him he had to get out of this thing and go to caravans. That's the caravan. He said, you made me a millionaire, Hal. I listened to you. He's got one of the largest, smallest airlines in Belize right now, operating caravans. But he was operating 3 or 4 different times at reciprocating airplanes. You know, it didn't make sense. But he's an example of somebody that took information. And I think, and I don't know how you would ever convince the president of TWA or others to listen to you, because they think they've got their own people. But I think what they overlook is the forest. You can't see the trees for the forest in many cases. That's my experience, at least. So it's tough. You young people coming into the business, it's not going to be easy. But as I said before, you can't let that star that you're fixed on diminish in brightness. You have to know that it's there. You have to keep it bright, and you have to keep plugging away. It may not work, but it sure is not going to work the other way if you give up. It's just not going to happen. And that's it, and sometimes I'll feel sorry for you guys because I've had such quote unquote an easy trip, as it were, through my airline career. That easy in the fact that there was always something for me to do, and that's not the case with facing you guys today. There's got to be some innovation. You have to think out of the box. I mean, anybody that thinks inside the box in this day and age is crazy. You got to think outside the box. Otherwise, that star is going to get dimmer and dimmer and dimmer, and you have to stick with it. If that's the only advice I can give your students. And I admire every one of you guys. You're a little bit like me in 1947. You're starting out with a pretty heavy deck stacked against you. But some of us make a success of it. And I hope that every one of you guys do it. Because it's a disease. Once you get in it, it's a disease. There's no known cure for it. And I don't care what facet you're studying, it's all interesting and fascinating and fast-moving, and there's no way to get it out from under your skin.
Well, I think that's about it. We wanted to thank you again for coming up to Prescott and doing this interview with us. We look forward to working with you in the future. We thank you for all of the information you've given us and all the insight into our industry, as well as everything you've given us. So I'd like to thank you for coming. We had Dr. Bloomstrom, Sebastian Hill, and AJ Smith, and we thank you both for coming up here and joining us for this interview.
Well, I'm always happy to be home here, and I'm always happy to do what I can to help young people move along the path. That's the key.